North Africa, 202 BC. Two armies face each other on open ground. On one side, Hannibal Barca, undefeated, 15 years in enemy territory, the man who crossed the Alps with war elephants, who killed 70,000 Romans in a single afternoon at Cannae, who held a multilingual army together through force of will alone. On the other, a Roman general, 33 years old. He had never won a major battle. Here is what most people do not know about the man who finally defeated Hannibal. Scipio did not beat him with superior numbers or better weapons or Roman stubbornness. He beat him by doing something no Roman commander before him had been willing to do. He spent years studying Hannibal. Every ambush, every encirclement, every psychological trap, and then used Hannibal's own methods to destroy him. The double envelopment that killed 70,000 Romans at Cannae was turned against its inventor at Zama.
Today, every serious military academy on Earth, West Point, Sandhurst, the Israeli Defense Forces, still teaches that reversal as the foundational case study in strategic adaptation. What Scipio grasped in 202 BC, commanders are still being trained to understand. To understand why Scipio matters, you first have to understand what Cannae actually did to Rome. August 2nd, 216 BC. By sunset, between 50 and 70,000 Roman soldiers were dead. Not defeated, dead. In a single afternoon, Rome lost more men than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War. The Senate received the news in silence. Then it received a second report. Both consuls had commanded that day. One was dead on the field. The other had fled with a handful of survivors. Rome had sent its largest army in history, 86,000 soldiers against a force of 50,000, on flat open ground, with numerical advantage, positional control, and every tactical condition in their favor.
And Hannibal had destroyed them so completely that Roman soldiers were still being found and buried 3 days later. The standard explanation taught in schools is that Hannibal was a genius. That explanation is true. It is also dangerously incomplete. What made Cannae catastrophic was not just the death toll. It was what the death toll represented institutionally. Among the dead were 80 senators, nearly a third of the Senate, 2 quaestors, 29 of 48 military tribunes, an entire consul. Rome had just lost, in one afternoon, a significant portion of the experienced leadership that ran the Republic. The men who understood Roman strategy, Roman logistics, Roman alliance management, the political architecture of the Italian Confederation. Gone. The city did not panic. This is the part that surprises people. Rome did not negotiate, did not surrender, did not even seriously consider it, despite losing the largest army it had ever fielded. The Senate passed emergency measures, freed slaves to fill the legions, stripped temples of their votive weapons, and began raising new armies within weeks. But the men who replaced the dead were different from the men they replaced. They were younger, less attached to the tactical orthodoxy, the dense infantry mass, the frontal engagement, the Roman way of fighting that Hannibal had now destroyed 3 times in 2 years at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and at Cannae. Less psychologically invested in methods that had just failed catastrophically. One of the survivors was 17 years old. He had watched the battle from the Roman rear, a junior officer, not yet old enough to command, present only because his father was one of the consuls leading the army. His father died on that field.
He escaped with the survivors. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio.
In the years that followed, while Rome adopted the Fabian strategy, avoiding direct engagement, bleeding Hannibal slowly through attrition, Scipio did something no senior Roman commander was doing. He studied Cannae, not as a wound, as a manual. He wanted to know exactly how the encirclement had worked, how Hannibal had used the Numidian cavalry, how the crescent formation had drawn the Roman mass inward before collapsing around it, how a smaller army had achieved the largest single-day kill ratio in the ancient world. What Scipio was building in those years of study was not revenge. It was a counter. But to use it, he first needed a command. And in 211 BC, Rome gave him one, under circumstances so desperate that no senior general wanted the assignment. If that kind of depth is what you come here for, subscribe and hit the bell. Every video on this channel goes where the textbooks stop. The question is, why Rome handed its most critical theater to a 24-year-old with no major victories? The answer reveals something about how institutions survive catastrophe, and it is more surprising than the battle itself. In 211 BC, Rome had a problem in Spain that nobody wanted to solve. 2 Roman armies had just been destroyed there. Both commanders, the young officer's father and uncle, were dead. Carthage controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula. The silver mines that funded Hannibal's entire operation, the supply network that kept his army in Italy, the recruitment ground for his Iberian soldiers, all of it ran through Spain. Whoever controlled Spain controlled the war's economic engine. The Senate needed a commander for the Spanish theater. It asked for volunteers. No one stepped forward. The assignment was considered a death posting. 2 experienced commanders had already gone to Spain and come back in pieces. The political calculus was simple. Accept the command, likely die, and Rome would find someone else for the next attempt. Then Scipio volunteered. He was 24 years old. Ancient sources record that the assembly went quiet when he stepped forward, then voted for him unanimously, not because they believed he could win, but because no one else had offered, and the theater could not be left uncontested. What the Senate did not know was that Spain was not just a defensive assignment to Scipio. It was a laboratory. He arrived in 210 BC with 28,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry. His first major operation was the assault on Cartagena, Carthago Nova, the administrative capital of Carthaginian Spain, the city through which all supplies, all silver, and all reinforcements for Hannibal flowed. Every Carthaginian commander considered Cartagena impregnable. It sat on a peninsula surrounded on 3 sides by water, with a large lagoon protecting the northern approach. The only viable assault vector was the narrow land bridge to the south, which the garrison could defend with a fraction of its troops. Scipio attacked from the south as expected, but he had spent weeks questioning local fishermen about the lagoon to the north. They told him something the Carthaginians had apparently stopped noticing. The lagoon was tidal. In the afternoon, when the north wind came, the water level dropped, shallow enough in places to wade. He sent 500 men with ladders across the lagoon during the afternoon assault. They scaled the northern wall while the garrison was entirely focused on the south. Cartagena fell in a single day. Most historians attribute this to luck. I think that misses the point entirely. Scipio did not get lucky with the tide. He asked questions no one else had thought to ask, about terrain everyone else had dismissed as settled. The lagoon was not a secret. It was ignored. There is a difference. and it is the same difference that would define everything at Zama. He used this method repeatedly across Spain. Every battle Scipio fought there was built on intelligence, on knowing something about the ground, the enemy's psychology, or the tactical situation that his opponent assumed he could not know. In 208 BC, at Bacula, he attacked Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother, commanding the main Carthaginian force, but not in the way Hasdrubal expected. Instead of the standard Roman frontal assault, Scipio sent his light infantry to fix the Carthaginian front, while his heavy infantry swept around both flanks simultaneously. A double envelopment. Cannae reversed. Hasdrubal recognized what was happening in time to retreat with most of his army. He escaped north, crossed the Alps following his brother's route, and marched into Italy to reinforce Hannibal. He never arrived. Roman forces destroyed his army at the Metaurus River in 207 BC. The first Hannibal knew of his brother's fate was when Roman soldiers threw Hasdrubal's severed head into his camp. By 206 BC, Scipio had cleared Carthage from Spain entirely. In 5 years, the 24-year-old with no major victories had done what 2 experienced commanders had died attempting. The laboratory was finished. The counter was ready. What remained was the question Scipio had been building toward since Cannae. Could Hannibal's own methods be used against him, on ground of your choosing, with an army trained specifically for that moment? There was only one way to find out, and it required convincing Rome to do something it had never seriously considered: take the war to Africa. Rome did not want to invade Africa. The Senate had spent 15 years in survival mode. Hannibal was still in Italy, undefeated, still dangerous, still capable of destroying any army Rome sent against him directly. The Fabian strategy was working, slowly. Why risk everything on an amphibious invasion of North Africa when the cautious approach was finally producing results? Scipio made his case in 205 BC. His argument was not emotional, it was strategic, and it was the same logic Hannibal had used in reverse 18 years earlier. You cannot win this war by defending Italy. Hannibal's army is a symptom. Carthage is the disease. As long as Carthage exists as a functioning state with resources, territory, and political will, it can replace armies, fund new commanders, and continue the war indefinitely. The only way to end it is to threaten Carthage itself. Force Hannibal to come home and fight on ground of our choosing, not his. The Senate gave him a compromise. He could take 2 legions, but they would be the legions from Sicily, largely composed of survivors from Cannae. The men Rome had formally disgraced for surviving the battle. The men who had been exiled to Sicily as punishment for what the Senate called cowardice. Scipio accepted without hesitation. He spent the next year in Sicily training them, not in the standard Roman method, the rigid frontal assault that Hannibal had destroyed 3 times. He trained them in flexible tactical units designed to respond to encirclement attempts. He trained his cavalry aggressively, specifically to counter Numidian horsemen, the same cavalry that had swept Roman flanks at Trevia, Trasimene, and Cannae. He drilled responses to war elephants, how to open lanes in the formation, let the animals charge through harmlessly between the ranks, then close and continue the engagement. He was not preparing a Roman army. He was preparing a counter-Hannibal army, built from the men Hannibal had already defeated once, and who had spent 8 years waiting for a second chance. In 204 BC, Scipio landed in North Africa with approximately 35,000 men. Within months, he had destroyed 2 Carthaginian field armies, one through a night assault on their encampment, setting it on fire while they slept, killing an estimated 40,000 men without a conventional battle engagement. It was not a maneuver Hannibal would have recognized as Roman. It was precisely the kind of unexpected approach Hannibal himself had always used. Carthage recalled Hannibal from Italy. After 15 years on Roman soil, never defeated in the field, never forced out by Roman arms, Hannibal simply ran out of strategic options. He had won every battle. He had lost the political war. The Italian allies he needed had not defected in sufficient numbers after Cannae, and without them his victories led nowhere. He sailed home to a city that was already losing the war he had been summoned back to fight. Ancient sources describe a meeting between Scipio and Hannibal before the battle. A negotiation attempt on open ground, the two commanders face to face without their armies. Hannibal proposed peace terms. Scipio refused. He had not come to Africa to negotiate. The two armies met at Zama in October 202 BC. Hannibal had 80,000 men and 80 war elephants, his opening weapon intended to shatter the Roman front before the infantry engagement began. Scipio had approximately 35,000. By every conventional measure, the numbers still favored Carthage. Scipio had anticipated the elephants. He had drilled his men for months on exactly one scenario: what to do when 80 tons of panicking animals charge your formation. The answer he had designed was not to hold the line. It was to open it. What happened next is the reason military academies still study this battle 2,000 years later. And it begins with the moment Hannibal gave the order to release the elephants, and watched them do exactly nothing. Hannibal released the elephants at dawn. 80 animals, each weighing 4 to 6 tons, charged the Roman front at full speed. At every previous engagement, this was the moment opposing infantry broke. Men who had never faced a charging elephant had one instinct: run. The Roman line did not break. It opened. Scipio had drilled his men to do something against every infantry instinct. When the elephants came, step aside. Create corridors. Let them through. The animals charged into gaps and out the back, where Romans drove them off the field with noise and javelins. Several panicked and turned back, trampling Hannibal's own cavalry on the left flank. The opening move Hannibal had relied on for 15 years produced nothing. Worse, it disordered his own lines before the infantry engagement began. Hannibal's infantry came in 3 lines: mercenaries first, Carthaginian citizens second, his veterans third, the men who had walked the Alps, fought at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, and never lost a battle in 15 years. Scipio's cavalry drove both Carthaginian wings from the field and pursued. For a moment, the Roman flanks were exposed. Hannibal pressed forward with his veterans. The battle was briefly in genuine doubt. Then the cavalry returned and hit Hannibal's army from the rear. The Cannae maneuver, used against its inventor. The encirclement was complete. Hannibal's veterans, men who had never lost, died surrounded on a North African plain. Hannibal escaped. Carthage sued for peace. The treaty stripped them of their navy, their elephants, their territories, and imposed 50 years of reparations. Hannibal spent the next 20 years as a fugitive. Rome pressured every king who sheltered him to hand him over. In 183 BC, surrounded, he took poison from a ring he had carried for years. His last words: "Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety, since they find it too long to wait for the death of an old man." The man who never lost a battle died alone in exile. But what his war set in motion did not end with him. It ended 50 years later with the complete erasure of Carthage itself. And that decision tells us something about fear, power, and imperial logic that has not changed in 2,000 years. Carthage did not die because of Hannibal. It died because of what Hannibal made Rome feel. This is the part of the story that most documentaries skip, and it is the part that connects directly to the world you live in today. After Zama, Carthage was no longer a military threat. The peace treaty of 201 BC had seen to that. No navy, no army above 10,000 men, no right to wage war without Roman permission. For 50 years, Carthage complied. It paid its reparations. It rebuilt commercially. By 150 BC, it was wealthy again. Not powerful, just prosperous.
That prosperity was the problem. In Rome, a senator named Cato the Elder ended every speech he gave in the Senate on any subject, agriculture, taxation, road construction, with the same 5 words: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Not weakened, not contained, erased. Cato had been born 11 years after Cannae. He had not fought in the war, but he had grown up in a Rome that remembered what it felt like to receive 70,000 dead in a single afternoon, to watch Hannibal march through Italy for 15 years untouched, to live with the knowledge that one man from one city had come closer to ending Rome than anyone before or since. The fear Hannibal had planted in the Roman psyche did not die with him. It calcified into policy. In 149 BC, Rome manufactured a pretext. Carthage had defended itself against a neighboring Numidian king, technically a violation of the treaty clause requiring Roman permission to wage war. Rome declared war.
The Third Punic War lasted 3 years. It was not a war. It was a siege and a demolition. In 146 BC, Roman forces under Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the man who had beaten Hannibal, breached the walls of Carthage. The city burned for 17 days. The Kothon harbor, the assembly line shipyard that had nearly destroyed Rome a generation before Hannibal was born, was pulled apart stone by stone. The population, estimated at 400,000, was killed or enslaved. The site was cursed. The story that Rome salted the earth is almost certainly a later invention. What Rome did was worse. It erased the historical record. Carthaginian libraries were burned or dispersed. The Punic language was suppressed. Within 2 generations, Carthage existed only as a Roman colony built on top of the ruins of the city it had destroyed. Today, the archaeological site at Carthage sits inside the modern city of Tunis, in Tunisia. Tourists walk past fragments of the Punic harbor. Most of what survived was excavated from the seabed in the 20th century, because Rome had been so thorough that the evidence had to be found underwater. That is the legacy of Zama. Not just a Roman victory, a Roman decision made 50 years later that a civilization which had produced Hannibal Barca could not be allowed to exist in any form. Think about what that means in the context of the world today. The United States spent 20 years in Afghanistan, a country that has defeated every empire that has tried to hold it, from Alexander to the Soviets, in part because of what one attack on one morning did to American strategic psychology. The logic of disproportionate response to existential fear is not ancient history. It is the operating system of every empire that has ever felt genuinely threatened. Rome looked at the ruins of its own confidence and decided the only safe Carthage was a dead one. The question worth asking, the one that connects Cannae to the present, is whether that logic ever actually produces safety, or whether it produces instead the next Hannibal, raised somewhere in the rubble, swearing an oath at an altar, spending his whole life preparing for one specific mission. History suggests we already know the answer. If you have made it this far, this channel was built for you. Subscribe and hit the bell. Every video goes this deep, and the next one is already in production. Now, what does Scipio Africanus actually leave behind? Not a technique, a principle. The Roman military tradition after Zama changed in ways that are still visible today. Before Scipio, Roman doctrine was essentially conservative. The manipular system, the frontal engagement, the assumption that superior numbers and Roman discipline would grind down any opponent. It had worked for 200 years. Then Hannibal destroyed it 3 times in 18 months. Scipio introduced something Rome had never systematized before. The idea that tactical doctrine must be built around the specific enemy you are facing, not the enemy you wish you were facing. He did not just beat Hannibal. He studied him, reverse-engineered him, and built a counter that was useless against any other opponent and lethal against exactly one. That approach, threat-specific military adaptation, is now the foundational principle of every serious military planning process on Earth. The United States military does not train for a generic enemy. It trains for specific adversaries: China, Russia, non-state actors, each requiring different doctrine, different equipment, different tactics. The entire apparatus of modern military intelligence exists to do what Scipio did manually, by asking fishermen about tidal patterns and watching Hannibal's battles from the rear. West Point has taught Zama continuously since the academy opened in 1802. Not as ancient history, as a case study in adaptive command, how a junior officer with limited resources and no institutional support built a counter to the most dangerous tactical system of his era through study, experimentation, and patience. Norman Schwarzkopf cited Cannae when he described the left hook in the 1991 Gulf War. He did not cite Scipio, but the logic was Scipio's. Identify what the enemy cannot respond to. Build the capability to execute it. Strike before they understand what is happening. There is a detail about Scipio that most accounts mention and almost none examine closely. After Zama, he returned to Rome as the greatest living Roman, Scipio Africanus, the man who had ended the war Hannibal had started. He was offered a consulship for life, effectively a dictatorship. He refused it. He continued participating in Roman political life as a citizen, not a ruler. He was later accused of corruption by political enemies and chose voluntary exile over a humiliating trial. He died in 183 BC, the same year as Hannibal, in his country villa, having reportedly asked that his tomb not be placed in Rome, the city he had saved. 2 men who had defined the ancient world for 20 years died in the same year on opposite ends of the Mediterranean, both in exile from the civilizations they had served. The symmetry is almost too clean to be history, but it is. What does that symmetry tell us? That the men who changed the course of events are rarely the ones who benefit from the change. Hannibal transformed Roman military doctrine, Roman institutional resilience, and Roman strategic ambition, and Carthage was erased. Scipio saved the republic that would eventually become an empire under Augustus, and died unwelcome in the city he had defended. The lesson history keeps delivering, and that we keep being surprised by, is that the people who make civilization possible are rarely the people civilization rewards. But the methods survive. Cannae is still taught.
Zama is still taught. The double envelopment is still executed. And somewhere, right now, in a staff college in Virginia or Tel Aviv or Beijing, a junior officer is studying a battle from 2,000 years ago and asking the same question Scipio asked at 17. What would it take to reverse this? There is a flat plain in Tunisia, a few kilometers outside the modern city of Zama Regia, where the ground is dry and the horizon is wide in every direction. No museum, no monument, no marker significant enough to find easily. 80,000 men fought there in October of 202 BC. The man who had never lost a battle finally lost one. The man who had never won a major battle won the only one that mattered. And the war that had consumed the Mediterranean world for 17 years ended not with a siege or a treaty negotiation, but with a cavalry charge into a rear that had nowhere left to retreat. We began this story with a paradox. The greatest battlefield commander in history defeated by someone who had never beaten anyone of consequence. Here is what that paradox actually means. Hannibal was the product of a system, a civilization that had built him deliberately from childhood for a single purpose. Hamilcar Barca took his 9-year-old son to an altar and extracted an oath because he understood that hatred, properly cultivated, is a strategic asset. Hannibal spent 30 years becoming the most dangerous man alive, and then spent 15 more years proving it on Roman soil. Scipio was the product of a catastrophe. He did not choose to study Hannibal. Cannae chose him, took his father, surrounded him with 70,000 dead, and gave him a question he could not stop asking. The catastrophe produced the counter. This is the pattern that runs through every empire on this channel. The thing that destroys an empire is rarely external. It is almost always the response the empire triggers. Rome's brutality in managing its Italian allies produced the conditions Hannibal needed. Hannibal's victories produced Scipio. Scipio's victory produced the fear that erased Carthage. The erasure of Carthage produced a Roman strategic confidence that would eventually make Rome believe it could absorb any threat. A confidence that held for 300 more years until it didn't. Every fallen empire on this channel follows some version of this sequence. The strength that makes an empire dominant also makes it blind to the specific weakness that will undo it. Hannibal saw Rome's weakness clearly: the Italian Confederation, the dependence on allied manpower, the political fragility behind the military machine. He was just wrong about whether exposing that weakness would be enough. Scipio saw Hannibal's weakness just as clearly: the dependence on a political outcome that Carthage was not willing to force, the tactical genius operating without strategic support, the brilliant general fighting a war his government had already half lost. He was right about all of it. The difference between them was not intelligence. It was that Scipio understood something Hannibal never fully accepted, that winning battles is not the same as winning wars, and that the enemy you need to defeat is not always the one standing in front of you. Hannibal spent 15 years in Italy trying to break Rome's will by destroying its armies. Rome's will did not break. Scipio spent 5 years in Spain and North Africa threatening the thing Rome's will was protecting, and Hannibal came home in a season.
If you want to understand why empires fall, that is the mechanism. Not the army that loses, the assumption that goes unexamined, the tidal lagoon nobody thought to ask about.
What empire today is fighting the wrong battle?
What assumption is being ignored because everyone stopped noticing it? History does not repeat, but the structure of how power fails, that repeats precisely. Share this with someone who thinks ancient history has nothing to say about the present. Tell us in the comments which empire you want to watch fall next. And if you have not seen our Cannae video, the battle where this story begins, it is linked at the end of this one. The ancient world was not simple. It just used different materials.